Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to Addis Dialogue. The Battle of Adwa was a significant turning point in the broader struggle against Western colonialism, playing a key role in weakening the narrative of Western supremacy that had dominated global politics for centuries. The victory of Adwa in 1896 is often seen as a pivotal moment in challenging Western colonial dominance. And as Ethiopia commemorates this historic victory, we're going to discuss how it helped dismantle the perception of Western supremacy. And in order to put it into perspective, Siphiwe Baleka is joining me. He's a great Pan-Africanist. I'm your host, Siphiwe Baleka. Do stay with us. All right, Siphiwe, thank you so much for making the time to talk to us.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's just jump right into it. And um, as you know, the Battle of Adwa saw the Ethiopian forces decisively defeat the Italian army, which was a European power back then. And this victory shattered the myth of European military superiority, particularly in Africa, where Western powers had been steadily expanding their colonial empires. In this regard, Siphiwe, how did the victory at Adwa challenge the myth of European military superiority, especially in Africa?
Well, there's a lot we can say about this, but let me give you a perspective from, say, the African diaspora, which, was those of us whose ancestors were trafficked as prisoners of war, right, from our ancestral homelands. Let's remember, it was Pope Nick. I'm going to set some historical background to really help us understand the Battle of Adwa.
All right.
We have to understand that it was Pope Nicholas V on June 18th, 1452, who issued the Dum Diversis Apostolic Edict that gave the authority to the King of Portugal to invade, fight, conquer, subjugate, take all possessions, movable and immovable, and reduce the people to perpetual servitude. So this was a declaration of war that came from Pope Nicholas V that gave the authority and started the invasion of the African continent, what some people now call the transatlantic slave trade. So the Battle of Adwa fits into one of the late stage battles in that war that started, right, with the Pope. And so at a late stage, the war has been going on for several hundreds of years. All of Africa is invaded. 100 million are killed on the continent, and 12 million are taken across the Atlantic. Then they have the Berlin Conference. At the Berlin Conference, these European powers who are fighting amongst themselves, they're engaged in European tribalism and European tribalistic wars amongst themselves. They decide that in order to stop fighting amongst the European tribes, that they would have these rules that if you occupy territory under various conditions on the African continent, based on this authority, this original authority that was given by the Pope in 1452, right, that part of Africa became yours. Now, by the time we get to the Berlin Conference, the late 1880s, Italy is not one of the most dominant European powers. They were somewhat left out of that. And so the only territories that remained were those territories in East Africa, particularly, right, the territory of Ethiopia as we know it today. Okay, so this is Berlin Conference, 1880s, right, 84, 85, in that time period. Now, right after that, leading up to the Battle of Adwa, just before that, in 1893, you have the Chicago World's Fair and the Chicago Congress on Africa. This is, as far as I know, the first time when Africans from the continent and Africans from the diaspora meet to discuss our common problems. Out of that meeting came the next meeting, which was the Congress on Africa in Atlanta. Okay? And then you have the Battle of Adwa. So the African diaspora had started to become conscious of the current events going on in Africa because we now have this connection. But in our minds, all we know of is Ethiopia, that what we get from the Bible stories. So it looms large in our imagination, this mythical ancient land, First Nation. But in current events, maybe we're thinking, okay, Ethiopians, they're just barefoot. We're not thinking about modern comforts and things like that. So in our minds, how is it that a people barefoot, right, without the modern weaponry that the Europeans have, how could they win? How could they overcome this, I won't call it the final invasion, but a late stage invasion that's part of this original Dum Diversis war? So for us in the diaspora, not only is it a practical military accomplishment, but it takes on even larger significance that this is something ordained by God, that God is on our side. And so the Battle of Victory gives us, the Battle of Adwa victory gives us hope that somehow justice will prevail for African people. Now, it's my understanding that after the Battle of Adwa, Emperor Menelik met with some of those African diasporans who had come out of the Chicago Congress on Africa, the Atlanta Congress on Africa, and he said, let's have a great Pan-African Congress to celebrate the victory of Adwa. And it was diasporans, it was William Ellis and Benito Sylvain, right, who then went on to help organize what we all learned to be the first Pan-African Congress that was held in London in 1900. It was directly related to the Battle of Adwa. And as a result of that, we now have this entire legacy of Pan-Africanism and Pan-African Congresses whose origin has a lot to do with the victory at Adwa.
Mm.
The lesson we get out of that is even if we are outmatched in terms of military superiority, they didn't calculate the power of Ethiopian unity. And we still have that lesson today. Pan-African unity is the variable that allows us to overcome any kind of material or military advantage that foreigners may have. That was part of the lesson of Adwa.
Wow, interesting. Moving on from there, Siphiwe, the Battle of Adwa was, of course, it was a turning point in the fight against colonialism, as many agree, by encouraging others to consider their struggles for independence. The victory helped foster African nationalism by showing that colonialism could be defeated with unity and strategy, right? So how did this victory diminish, if you will, the perceived inevitability of Western dominance, proving that African sovereignty could be maintained through resistance while contributing to the rise of African nationalism and, of course, anti-colonial sentiment across the continent.
Well, you're absolutely right. And remember, this is before, say, Garvey's time. Okay. So, of course, ever since the invasion, right, of our continent on both sides,
Yeah.
the east side and the west, we've always resisted, we've always fought, we've had victories and defeats for hundreds of years in the invasion. But the Battle of Adwa is, I would say, post-Berlin Conference, the first real, definitive victory that we had in the modern era. We're talking about you had modern weapons of war. So I agree with you, absolutely. It becomes a symbol that the colonial powers are not all powerful. We started to believe in ourselves, and maintaining Ethiopian sovereignty, Ethiopian independence, sparked the imagination in African people everywhere else that it was attainable. I fully agree with that. It's a landmark moment in our history. And of course, then, we can connect that, it was a humiliation for colonial powers, particularly the Italians. And then as the hand of destiny moves forward a few decades, right? History tries to repeat itself again, right? And so the Italians, realizing that they're losing out, they have running out of time to actually get a colonial empire in Africa, because all the other European nations, those tribalistic nations, they are developing because of what they're getting from Africa, what they are taking by means of conquest. And so Italy is left out of this. And in order to compete with the other European tribes, the Italians realize they need some colonial possession. So after Adwa, they try again later in 1935. It's totally connected, and they're defeated again. And that is the moment where, as we know, following that, very soon after that, you have the Mau Mau in Kenya. You have the entire modern African liberation movement that resulted in the independence of all these AU member states that we have now. So it's Adwa that gives us the foundation, the confidence. We do it again a few decades later, and then from that, we have all these liberation movements on both sides of the Atlantic. It's not just African liberation movements in Africa. There are African liberation movements in the West. For example, in the United States, you had the Republic of New Africa that wasn't a civil rights movement. It was a nationalistic movement where Black people in America were fighting to establish a nation of their own on territory claimed by the United States so that they could join the Organization of African Unity as a new African state. All of this is connected in one narrative, one story, where Adwa really is that. It's not the first chapter, but it's the turning point. Absolutely.
A great insight indeed. So obviously the victory of Adwa galvanized the diaspora and also the Black community at home into action to fight for their liberation, independence, and freedom. Beautifully put. So the victory of Adwa, I think, continues to resonate with the current generation, particularly in the context of African pride, resistance, and the ongoing struggle for equality. In this regard, how does the victory of Adwa inspire the current generation of Africa in their fight for social justice and political autonomy?
I think that sometimes in the minds of African masses of people, we think the problems are so overwhelming and so massive. And we have suffered from real military conflict. And you still have AFRICOM command in Africa in places. You still have, former colonial powers bases. Sometimes we look at their their power, their might, their weaponry,
Yeah.
their military advantages. We look at that, sometimes not understanding that the source of that was African people and African
Mm.
wealth that's in the ground. But sometimes we look at that and we might have an inferiority complex or a kind of defeatism where, in the West, you used to say, you can't fight the man, you can't fight City Hall.
Mm.
Um, I think Adwa really helped us overcome that sense of inferiority and defeatism. And for the generations, especially the young people now who are maybe learning about the Battle of Adwa for the first time, 1896, that's more than, 120 some years ago, right? And they're learning about that. And it is an immense source of pride that we had such a military victory against overwhelming odds. And I believe it was Marcus Garvey who talked about, uh, having hope. If you
Mm.
lose hope, you've lost everything. And Ethiopia in the Battle of Adwa has given us a firm foundation that no matter what the overwhelming odds look like, we can still defend our sovereignty. We can defend it. And that's the most important lesson.
Exactly. Talking about Marcus Garvey, how did the victory of Adwa, contribute to this vision of a united and independent Africa, as articulated by Pan-Africanism leaders such as Marcus Garvey, W.B. Du Bois, and others?
Well, again, we would have to go into go talk to the other scholars, the historians, to find
Yeah.
real direct evidence. But what we do know is that Benito Sylvain, right, or Sylvain, he was a Haitian who was in London, who was aide de camp to Emperor Menelik. Okay, it was Benito Sylvain who talked about Martin Delany, who was an African American who had said Africa for the Africans. Okay, he was the first to say that. And we know that Benito Sylvain, as aide de camp to Emperor Menelik, had brought these ideas to Emperor Menelik, so that after the Battle of Adwa and the victory, again, the Pan-African movement that emerged from the Pan-African Congresses, particularly the 1900 Congress in London, was directly inspired by the victory at Adwa. That was its raison d'etre. Emperor Menelik had asked that we celebrate that victory so that the African world and the world at large, right, would remember and learn its lessons. So it's the Pan-African Congresses that come first in 1900. Then you start to have African Americans repatriate to Ethiopia. The very first one, Robert Daniel Alexander, in 1908, right? So within 10 years, within one decade, we are starting to repatriate. And shortly after that, then you have Marcus Garvey, who takes the victory of Adwa, right, and crystallize it in a form to talk about a one Africa, a one government, a one powerful, you can call it an Ethiopian Union, you can call it an African Union, you can call it a United African States, right? None of that would have been possible had there been a defeat at Adwa. It wouldn't have been possible in such a short amount of time. It would have taken decades, maybe even 100 years, for us to get to that level and where we are now. It would have been delayed had there not been the victory at Adwa.
How did this victory at Adwa specifically inspire the Pan-African movement and influence the early Pan-African leaders?
Well, again, they knew each other and they were meeting, right? So they were talking. So they were very aware of what took place in Ethiopia. Again, primarily through, right, Benito Sylvain, right, who served as aide de camp. So these leaders, again, they were having these meetings at the
Yeah.
Chicago Congress, the Atlanta Congress, and the
Mhm.
Pan-African Congress. That's where they put all the strategies together, right? No victory at Adwa. There's no first Pan-African Congress in 1900 in London, which led eventually to what? The Manchester 1945 Pan-African Congress. And there you actually have Jomo Kenyatta and Kwame Nkrumah as secretaries who go on, right, to become what? The first presidents and, you know, leaders of their independence movements and presidents. So those early leaders, right, we're all aware and we're discussing and we're moved and inspired by what the victory at Ottawa demonstrated was possible. And I'll give you another example, right? I would say that a lot of the credit should go to the Rastafari movement for holding the memory of the victory at Ottawa, because you know, the Rastafari movement in their culture, promoting the red, gold, and green, identifying with an Ethiopian identity, were the ones that studied Ethiopian history and were celebrating. This is an official celebration on the Rastafari sacred calendar, right? The Battle of Adwa.
Wow.
And so I would say more than any other people, right? It's the Rastafari people, the movement, the culture that culturally celebrated the victory of Adwa and kept it in our memory. So there's a debt of gratitude that goes out to the Rastafari people for doing programs, educational programs, teaching the youth about the battle and its significance. And there's artwork, and I can see right now there's a famous painting where you see the two contending armies fighting. There is the Rastafari culture made those things cultural products and distributed into the, you know, African people globally to keep that part of our history alive.
Definitely, that's a good point to convey. So I have really enjoyed our discussion so far. Maybe before we wrap up our discussion, any final thoughts, any final message that you want to convey? It's all yours. The floor is yours.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to share a little known story, right? After the Battle of Adwa, right, in 1917, Charles Holmes wrote a book called Ethiopia, the Land of Promise. And in this book, there were a group of men. They all had dreams at night. And on the 5th of every month and on May 5th of every year, they all had the same vision. And it was a vision of a parade of African people, all with red, gold, and green flags, with drums, and it's a parade, and there's soldiers. And this was 1917, right after the, you know, just a few, what is that, 20 years after the Battle of Adwa. But this is also 20 years before the second invasion by the Italians that came in 1935. Now, we know that it was Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie. He left Ethiopia to go to the League of Nations and defend Ethiopian sovereignty on May 5th. And exactly 5 years later, on May 5th, he returned, right, to victorious in that, let's call it the second Battle of Adwa, okay? The point I'm trying to make is, how is it possible that a book could be written that describes exactly the scene on May 5th, 1941, right, when Ethiopian sovereignty is permanently defended is the last invasion by the Italians. What I'm getting at is that there are spiritual, mystical things that surround the Battle of Adwa and the second invasion, and as we all know, this land of Ethiopia. There are things that go beyond just what you read in the history books, and these come to us in dreams, revelations, prophecies. And this is how the Battle of Adwa was reported in the press, in the diaspora, and it was also how it was reported when the Italians invaded again. So I just wanted to emphasize that it's a matter of history, it's a matter of military history, but it's also a matter of mystical history.
Siphiwe Baleka, Pan-Africanist. Thank you so much for giving me this wonderful idea and of course your wonderful and precious time. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. As we say in Guinea-Bissau, no sta junto. We are together.
Exactly, exactly. And I hope we will also meet sometime in the future. Keep up the great job and keep the fight for our beloved continent, Africa.
Aluda continua. Harambe, Amanla, Awetu. Different African languages, but one Africa.
Yes,
the power is ours.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, ladies and gentlemen, with that, we come to the end of today's program. Many thanks to you as well for having been with us so far. Until I see you next time with yet another program, it's a goodbye from me, Shipara.